Statistics South Africa's findings released yesterday show that the country's GDP, or gross domestic product, increased by 0.6% in the fourth quarter of 2024, following a 0.1% decrease in the third quarter of the same year. The agriculture, forestry and fishing industry were the main contributors to the positive growth, increasing by 17.2% and contributing 0.4 of a percentage point to the GDP growth. To talk more about the latest findings, what does this mean for our economic growth? We're joined by Joe de Beer. He's the Deputy Director General for Economic Stats at Statistics South Africa. It's great to have you. Thanks very, very much for your time.
Good morning.
So, looking at these numbers, 0.6% GDP growth, one would say that this certainly isn't sufficient to start seeing any change for that high unemployment rate that we find ourselves in.
Yes, I think we should, however, be glad that it's positive and didn't repeat the negatives that we saw in the third quarter. You're quite correct. The 0.6 gave us also an annual rate for the entire year of 0.6. And if we cast our minds back 12 months, many economists or analysts were predicting that the 2024 year might see us go to 1.2, 1.5. So it came in quite a bit lower than expectations at the time. But what is always difficult with these annual forecasts is you never know what's going to happen, especially with something like agriculture. So we couldn't predict the mid-year drought that we had, which caused that decline in Q3 for agriculture, which sort of upset everybody's annual forecasts.
So, obviously, with speaking about agriculture, forestry, fishing, this is the good news, increasing by 17.2%, as we say, contributing 0.4% to the GDP, that positive growth. This obviously weather dependent. How do we attribute this growth? What have we read into the sector growing like this?
So the fourth quarter's growth was boosted by animal products, but also field crops. So what happened in Q4 was because we had the mid-season drought, a lot of the harvesting in agriculture was shifted to a little bit later. So we saw some growth in the fourth quarter that you might not have typically found in Q4, but rather in the third quarter. And then there's also obviously base effects. If Q3 contracted by that much, any growth that you're going to show is going to be a fairly high percentage coming from the low base.
Yeah, these are wins. They certainly are wins, but they're very volatile wins at that. But let's talk about those sectors that are really not growing and in fact are struggling. And the ones that I'm looking at: manufacturing, mining, construction sectors. These are experiencing declines, and one could read that this is undermining the broader economic stability and growth prospects. These are massive sectors that are just not seeing growth. They're declining.
Yes, mining and manufacturing is also industries that contribute a lot to our employment. So I think it's of a concern if they are not expanding. On the side of manufacturing, most of the drags on the growth came from automotive and related sector and iron and steel types of industries. But what is interesting is out of the 10 industries we identify each quarter, when we unpack the numbers, 7 of them were in decline. But their declines were relatively small, so that their contribution to the overall GDP was sort of what we call a negative zero. It was really on the margins that they were negative. Apart from manufacturing, because of its size, it actually subtracted 0.1, 0.2 percentage points off the growth. But as you mentioned, construction is struggling, mostly residential and non-residential. And if we look at the counterpart on the demand side of the economy, that also then reflected in poor numbers for fixed capital formation. Yeah. Because if you're not building the residential and non-residential thing, you're not going to see it in the capex.
It blows my mind about the construction sector, because that would be one sector where we certainly do have the manpower to do that. But more importantly, we have the need for this construction sector to flourish. One would just look at something like what we focused on last week, the inner city of Johannesburg, and the decay that we're watching in front of our eyes. The roads that need work, the buildings that we need these things to work. That's a construction sector. Is that something that we talk about job creation, we talk about infrastructure decay, and this being one of the problems why we are not growing as a country. Do you think this has been highlighted enough to focus on growing our economy?
I think everybody is aware of the job creation opportunities inside the construction industry. It is quite a labor-intensive industry. So I think that is an area that policy is targeting. We might see in 2025, if the interest rate environment becomes a bit more accommodating, that might also boost investment on the capital expenditure side. But out of interest, if we look at the capital expenditure estimates we had for the fourth quarter, the area of growth was more in intangible assets. And that was mostly things like expenditure on computer software and intellectual property type of capital formation, rather than the cement and the nuts and bolts that you would typically see.
Yeah, and one needs to see that, especially with water infrastructure, electricity, as we mentioned, the construction and building. I mean, these are places where we need to get South Africans working to fix this so the country in general can work. I mean, that would be, I suppose, I'm no economist, but that would make a lot more sense to me. I want to get back to manufacturing, because the steel industry is a very worrying one, and one that certainly we did see production very high at one stage, but now, of course, they're key industries. This steel one, particularly with the closure of major steel plants, this is obviously threatening a lot of jobs as well and hampering growth.
Yes, it's indeed a worrying prospect. We'll have to keep an eye on the numbers. Once the different factories close down, we will start seeing it in our short-term indicators, and that will then feed through our estimates of the GDP from Q1 this year, maybe into Q2. We will have to see whether that impacts on the makeup of our imports and exports, but it does have a ripple effect. One of the big advantages of strong expenditure in the capital formation area, or its counterpart in construction, is it has very much a ripple effect on the rest of the economy. Because if you're going to build something, you need some inputs that come from mining or from manufacturing. You also need services. You need the architects and the accountants. So even though the construction industry might be fairly small, 2% of GDP, the moment that grows, the impetus it gives to many other industries, that's really where you get the benefit from it.
Yeah. Let's just talk in general, the growth of South Africa and the growth there of the economy, because, you know, we have traditionally been seen and still are categorized, I think, as an emerging market. This is it's worrying, because we haven't seen South Africa emerging in terms of growth in quite some time. Are we still classified as an emerging market when we actually look into the deeper thing, where obviously this prolonged economic stagnation of our economy is something that we need to be very, very concerned about? Are we still an emerging market?
That comes to maybe a bit of a definitional issue on how the World Bank decides, or the IMF decides to categorize us. But I think we are still broadly categorized as an emerging higher middle income country. But there are so many uncertainties. And earlier in your show, you had the inputs from the developments in the USA, and if there's going to be tariffs and counter tariffs, and how all of that's going to impact on South Africa, we will have to wait and see. It can have a really detrimental impact on us if things don't go our way.
Yeah, that is a concern, and that was going to really be my closing question to you. I mean, when we talk about the US's stance and also the threat of AGOA, the threat of pulling out aid, I mean, these are things that certainly are going to affect South Africa. Has this been sort of looked at in terms of what the impact can actually be on the growth of South Africa's economy?
I'm sure my colleagues in the policy departments, DTIC, Treasury, are looking very closely on what the impact of this could be, including the Reserve Bank. And I'll need to try to model what the outcome could be of different decisions that are taken, and then try to, as best as possible, come up with solutions to these obstacles that we might face.
Yeah. All right. We leave it there. Thank you. Thanks so much, Joe. Joe de Beer is the Deputy Director General for Economic Statistics at Stats SA, talking to us about the latest gross domestic product. And this is a big thing for us. I mean, as we wrap this up, Sakina, interesting note to leave this on. I mean, when we look at the average for emerging markets and the growth of these countries, the average at this point is 3.9%. We are
Well, we've been lagging behind
Really, for a long time.
A long time, but I think Joe is right in that, it would be a bit of a semantic issue. But are we still, part of that? I'm sure we are.
Yeah, suppose we are. But
yeah,
it's risky. It's risky. We need growth.
We need to grow.
We need growth. We really do.
And hopefully it will start happening.